Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you here on this it's a muggy afternoon, I'm going to say. It's overcast where I am, but warm. So I hope you've all, I hope your hay fever isn't causing you too much discomfort. But we're delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for our webinar. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome along Alex Quigley. And for those of you who don't know, Alex is a very highly regarded, very influential, and very compelling, convincing speaker and writer about all things to do with English and cognitive science. And Alex has got a very, very, very easy job for today. He's going to be talking about how we master the fundamentals of reading and writing. And he's going to cover that in about 45 minutes. So it's going to be a really straightforward, easy, slow session. Today's session is going to take the following structure. So we'll be welcoming Alex in just a few seconds. And then after that, Alex will also be doing a bit of a Q&A in that time. I will then spend a little bit of time sharing some information with you about the English Mastery Education Endowment Foundation trial that we're currently recruiting for. And I'll also I'll tell you some insights about a fantastic piece of news we've had. Our 2019 report was published by the EEF on Friday, and I'll be sharing some insights with you on that too. So lots to get through. I think without any further ado, I should hand over to you, Alex. Alex, thank you very much for joining us, and I will stop sharing. Do you have a slide deck that you'd like to bring up?
I do, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex.
Can you just make me co-host just so I can enable sharing?
More make co-host, and I'll stop share.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for coming, everyone, and those people who are able to access this remotely via recording, etc. I'm really pleased to speak. I've spoken for the English Mastery team before. I work for the EEF 4 days a week and do some writing, etc., and some training on the other day. And my background is an English teacher. I was an English teacher for just over 15 years in a school in York. I still live in York, and I spend a lot of time working with the team at the EEF, who are all school leaders from around the country. And as you can imagine, lots of my friends are school teachers, English teachers. My sisters are teachers as well. So I have that type of background. So although there's a reality of my being out of the classroom currently, I hope that I can reflect some of the challenges and realities that you still face. I've got a session and a presentation called Mastering the Fundamentals, as Nick intimated, and what I wanted to do is just tackle some of the bigger issues that I think are particularly salient right now, those issues that relate to some skills and knowledge that people's have always found challenging, that we've always recognized are crucial, and yet given the realities of the last couple of years are yet more critical and fundamentals that we need to make sure that pupils master successfully. So I'll give you a really brief background to the EEF first, if you don't know. So we are an independent charity. We've been going for around 11 years now, and we're probably most famous for our teaching and learning toolkit, but we generate lots of evidence from schools. English Mastery is part of that reality, lots of literacy approaches from Nelly in the early years to English Mastery in secondary school. We generate evidence, we distill it, and we try and mobilize it. And that's particularly my job. So I had the pleasure of co-writing some of our guidance reports, actually, but particularly the Improving Literacy in Secondary School. It's an area I'm really passionate about. I think English is obviously a critical subject, and I will focus very much on the English curriculum right now. But if we were to have literacy working well across the curriculum, if we were to have reading and writing, knowledge and skill reinforced strategically in every subject domain, I think we'd see significant differences. So the guidance report's broader than just English, of course, but it covers areas that will be familiar. So vocabulary, reading, writing, combining reading and writing, academic talk, and more. And in this session, I'll actually only really address some aspects of reading and writing. Of course, in about a half hour, I can only do so much, but hopefully it whets your appetite to find out some more. And also consider and reflect upon aspects of the Key Stage 3 curriculum that you already have, the challenges your pupils are facing, and where other supports like the English Mastery curriculum may be of help to you. I want to start with something very specific. I want you to read this short passage from the end of Grapes of Wrath. And then I just want you to reflect upon the different allusions, any imagery, any references to other texts that this short passage makes you consider. It could be stylistic, could be thematic, it could be generic, but I just want you to unpack that wealth of knowledge you bring to the page. So I'll stop talking and I'll just give you a moment to read that final paragraph, and then we'll talk a little bit about the background knowledge required to make full sense of this text. Okay, I just want you to reflect upon the imagery and the background knowledge that you bring to the page here. You may be very familiar with Grapes of Wrath. You may have taught it. I've never taught Grapes of Wrath. Personally, I've taught Steinbeck and of course of Mice and Men. And yet Grapes of Wrath is a text that I read years back. And when I read this short passage near the end of the text, it's redolent with imagery. It makes me think of a whole wealth of literature. And just this reflection that every time we read, it's not just about vocabulary knowledge and reading the words on the page fluently, although that is a fundamental aspect of understanding what you read. There's also the reality that whenever you're doing English, you've just got this wealth of background knowledge, knowledge of the world, knowledge of literature, knowledge of genre, knowledge of language, knowledge of meaning. And that is why it's so critical that our curriculum is carefully organized, sequenced, our choices are explicit and intentional. And of course, we cannot encompass the richness of all of English and world literature, but we can carefully navigate it and we can make those connections. We can help pupils better understand imagery, metaphor, allusion, and we can help them have the tools to tackle complex texts like Grapes of Wrath. And if I just show you some inferences, and it's interesting here how you will have made inferences and allusions that I perhaps won't have done. I'll bring a different set of understandings to the text. And that's where so much of that dialogue that happens in the classroom is rich with difference and, you know, that variety of background knowledge. So my first consideration is the biblical imagery inherent in that text. So there's the milk of human kindness, there's that kind of devastating struggle of the Great Depression. So we're thinking of the book of Revelations and that milk of human kindness image and reference point and the morality that underpins this text. And we're thinking about the historical context of America that you can't separate from the Grapes of Wrath. You can also think about images in art and images, again, that are biblical and that are religious in terms of Michelangelo's Pieta. You might think also, and pupils readily do this, think about connections across the curriculum. It may be the poem that we've studied the week before or the day before, but it may be it's an intentional focus about how our Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 and 5 connect with other texts. So Inspector Calls, you know, what's its relevance in terms of morality? What's its relevance in terms of power and social class? There's lots of interesting inferences and allusions and symbolic connections we can make between those texts. And if we were to spend more time than we have, if we were to spend 10 minutes discussing Grapes of Wrath, that short paragraph, we would bring so much background knowledge because we're in this room because we mastered the fundamentals of reading fluently. We read with pleasure and we read with skill and speed because we mastered those fundamentals early, very early, in fact, far earlier than Key Stage 3 and secondary school. And therefore we're able to write about what we read with fluency and skill. We take the likes of our handwriting and sentence composition skills often for granted, but for our pupils, it's really critical that they're able to combine all of these complex moves every time they're asked to read and write. And that complexity of reading and writing is something that we constantly need to face up to, because it's the lived reality of our pupils. So many times they're reading a poem, they're reading a classic text, and it's like they're reading in translation, they're reading in German or French. So that reality is something that we need to consider. That reality is something that we can't ignore. We can't just change and overhaul the curriculum. We have to give our pupils the tools to access complex texts, to navigate the rich vocabulary, the imagery, and the opportunities that they pose, even for struggling readers and writers. So we need to recognize this ample background knowledge that we draw upon, and we need to help pupils be more strategic to do that at timely moments and to write appropriately about context and not overwrite, that classic error of a pupil, doing a kind of unpacking a quotation and then going off into a kind of a paragraph of history that doesn't bear close relation to the meanings of the text. We need to think about how students are strategic and knowledgeable and how they build a sense of text. So when we're reading a short unseen poem, a sonnet, there is something compact, compressed about that genre and structure that pupils find accessible, and yet the language is often dense and complex and difficult. But lots of the time, for the likes of Grapes of Wrath or a novel, we're thinking about chunking that text out. We're thinking about what background knowledge is required to unlock the text without laboriously explaining everything and killing the motivation to read on. So how are we building those mental models? And this is about curriculum decisions, and this is about teaching decisions. And when we have that rich dialogue, and when we model, and when we do think aloud when we're reading, and when we break down difficult texts. We also have to consider, and so much of reading and writing provide two sides of the same coin. We're writing about what we read. We know from the research evidence that writing about what you read enhances your understanding, and also it consolidates and almost slows your thinking down. And yet for lots of pupils, their transcription skills, their ability to spell and their handwriting is actually using up their mental bandwidth. So we need to make those skills and strategies automatic. Spelling, handwriting, typing, that leaves enough of that working memory to tackle the text that they're reading, to be able to make selections of vocabulary and sentence structures and argument, to be able to make extended writing fluent and successful. And we need to think about this balancing act when it comes to writing too, about how much do we write? So if our end goal, GCSE and A-level, are extended, cogent essays, balanced arguments that draw upon lots of rich evidence from the text and the cultural context, do we jump straight into the big game, into the marathon of that extended writing? Or how do we break it down into those smaller sprints? Where do we have sentence level composition and move to paragraph level development and move to the full marathon? And these choices are really important. They're particularly critical for those students who are struggling at Key Stage 3, just with their basic fundamentals. And we know that a quarter of students who enter Key Stage 3 aren't at the expected standard of reading in Year 6. And so straight away, we recognize at least a quarter of our students are going to be struggling to fully access the curriculum. So thinking carefully about our curriculum design, our sequencing, when we build insights and literary devices and an understanding of literature and the canon, where those decisions are made becomes really important. I think that's where the likes of English Mastery is so helpful, is that it does a lot of that work for you. It does a lot of the building of resources and sequencing of the curriculum to allow those important pedagogical choices to happen. When our pupils need an additional kind of sprint of sentence level practice, as opposed to running the full marathon. So This is a complex act. We don't assume that pupils are accessing it. In fact, we know that many aren't. And I won't talk a lot about the pandemic, but one of the realities, the EEF will release evidence in just a couple of weeks' time about the broad evidence on the impact of the pandemic. And we know that reading's been impacted, particularly for young children, but across pupils in different age groups. And for disadvantaged pupils, they've been disproportionately impacted. And that's no surprise to us. For those pupils, they may not have had easy access to tech, to books, that easy access to that literate environment, that ability to talk about the text that we're sharing here, to make those allusions. And often that's supported in terms of generational literacy and that ability to read and understanding of the English curriculum. So it's a complex act and we need to think hard about it. And of course, we're already grappling with that difficulty. It just so happens that some of the barriers of the last 2 years have made it yet harder. So what are those current challenges? Well, there's no singular challenge. We know that. And there's no single silver bullet either. We could take on a curriculum like English Mastery, and we'd still need to think really carefully about supporting and training our colleagues, about the needs and barriers of individual pupils. So there might be issues, so many school leaders and teachers talking to me about attendance. Well, they can have a great curriculum and we can think carefully about the teaching, but if they're not in the room, that's a fundamental barrier. And then we have issues around reading fluency. For some pupils, they're not getting that practice outside the school gate. So how do we give them those supports? How do we kind of turbocharge that reading fluency in year 7 or in year 9, particularly for those pupils who've had their practice hampered over the past couple of years? And so this is about being really precise, using our assessment practices, thinking hard about what supports our pupils need and what successes they can experience in Key Stage 3 and beyond. And that's much more than text choice. It is thinking about pupils' barriers. It is thinking about that knowledge and skill development being carefully organized and sequenced. So let's just tackle some of these problems. And again, I don't pose these as easy answers, but just some reflections on our practice and how we can integrate that with our Key Stage 3 curriculum. So let's take reading fluency. I think my experience, I taught for 15 years. I taught English to Key Stage 3, 4 and 5. I did some work in primary schools with young children. I taught child language acquisition at A level. And yet very little of my teaching knowledge was allocated to the teaching of reading fluency. I made assumptions that this was done, this was covered in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And then more and more, I experienced those pupils. I sat next to them and asked them to read a paragraph of A Christmas Carol, and they couldn't read with fluency, where they were breaking down and reading in that robotic fashion, word for word. And it wasn't until I had so many of those experiences that I started to consider, well, this isn't just about picking text. I can't pick a text other than Shakespeare and Dickens, etc. So I have to be really precise about making sure they access the text. I started to think a lot more about explicit vocabulary teaching and cumulative vocabulary development in the curriculum, and also particularly reading fluency. I think reading fluency is a solution that we can address rather quite quickly. It's something that improves reading comprehension, and there are certain strategies that are done to allow people to better access complex texts. And we think about those aspects of reading. What is fluency? Well, it's got aspects of prosody, automaticity, that kind of fluent rhythm of talk, and then accuracy. So it is about understanding reading fluency, but it's about assessing it and understanding it at a level of a pupil level. So in our Key Stage 2 literacy guidance, we use the multi-dimensional fluency scale from Rosinski. And this is actually a scale that I've used. I've used it at GCSE and Key Stage 3. I've used it for struggling students. I've written about before how I've sat next to pupils and just spent 2 minutes and asked them to read a poem and to read a piece of prose, and just identified some of their specific issues with reading fluency. And that allowed me then to make choices around teaching, and also where there was something explicitly, damaging above and beyond that people's, ability to receive teaching and curriculum, I was able to identify where special education needs were were needed too. And the more I dug into fluency, the more I recognized, well, actually, there's some practices and approaches in the classroom that we can use routinely. Simple things, repeated reading. So when we're reading poetry and unseen poetry at GCSE, and we're thinking about poetry collections and comparing poems, we instinctively repeatedly read. But what the evidence seems to indicate, particularly for struggling readers, is that repeated reading should be something we do consciously, explicitly, reading with different goals each time, and to get really refined and strategic. Echo reading, this act of our reading aloud ourselves, modeling that reading, and then pupils reading it back. Choral reading, where we read together. Recording of reading and talking about that performance. So much of this is about pupils building that confidence and skill to perform the act of reading with fluency. And when they do that, they don't just sound better in class, they don't just build their confidence, it enhances their comprehension. And comprehension and fluency, it's like a kind of an infinity symbol where they constantly reinforce and support one another in a reciprocal fashion. And in the likes of readers' theatre, a very structured way to build up those practice, that repetition, and those fluency acts. If you look at the Key Stage 2 Literacy Guidance Report, you can read about readers' theatre. And I think that's particularly helpful for our nurture groups and those pupils in year 7, 8, and 9 who are struggling to access the curriculum. And then we move on to another aspect of reading. And of course, reading is multifaceted. You know, if we think about reading as a house, it's got all these different rooms of decoding ability, of fluency, of vocabulary. And what we need to be conscious of is reading comprehension limitations. When you read that passage earlier from Grapes of Wrath, I didn't have to worry about your inability to read those words and to make inferences and to make those global connections and allusions because you had so much background knowledge. For our students, they're often lacking in the requisite background knowledge, and they need support with reading strategies that can piece that knowledge together. So this again is a reciprocal approach where if we teach explicitly reading strategies like prediction, where we're questioning the text and we're reading aloud and we're mimicking, we're doing that think aloud of what a good reader does with a complex text, then we can start to help them build that mental model, cohere their understanding of the text, particularly when there's gaps in their background knowledge or word knowledge. So in the guidance, we look about the different approaches, and you can think about what we do as a good reader before we read, during reading, and after reading. And what we're not encouraging here is that on Mondays we do activating prior knowledge, and on Tuesdays we make predictions. These are not generic skills. These are strategies that we use appropriately for a given text. So if we're reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, then you can know where pupils can go looking in a passage to make predictions, to make inferences about dubious characters, to find clues about, delayed revelations in the text. We can model monitoring and understanding when pupils are struggling over words and asking questions about what words and phrases and allusions mean. We can help them build a sense of the text by modeling that strategic approach. It won't compensate for the lacking word knowledge and world knowledge, but these things can be reciprocal and benefit one another. So we can dig into, what does activating prior knowledge mean? What does it look like in the classroom? And I think in the likes of English Mastery, there's lots of approaches there that activate prior knowledge, where we're using quizzing, we're identifying vocabulary, we're zooming in on the text and unpacking it, but we're thinking about those allusions and metaphors, and we're thinking across text too, to reinforce that understanding across the curriculum. And we might then think about, what does summarization look like? What does it look like verbally in a just a minute type approach, or in debating and discussion? What does summarizing look like in terms of notes? Perhaps we've got a structured approach to note taking when we're reading Dr. Jekyll or we're reading Dickens. Perhaps we're focusing on a summarization sentence where we're getting pupils to pithily capture the core meaning of a poem in a single sentence. But we should be explicit about these fundamental approaches. Our strongest readers and writers will do so many of these things instinctively, but lots of our struggling students don't. And those students in the middle, that quiet mass in the middle, will benefit from deliberate approaches to knowledge building and to being strategic, particularly with complex texts. So approach like reciprocal reading, of course, we have image association. We could use those images earlier on to connect those allusions. We might have a strategy like Connect 4, where we take 4 words, 4 quotes, 4 phrases, and get pupils to make as many inferences as possible. We might, elicit those allusions and ask for conclusions, again, being deliberate about every move in the complex act of reading. And we might just, again, be deliberate about starting with a certain allusion, a thematic approach or language feature. We're finding 3 examples of that. Or anchor quotes. Again, another strategic way to read where we've identified the point in the text. We've identified a quote, and then we want pupils to identify, events, imagery before that anchor point and after that anchor point. All of these approaches help pupils to strategically navigate long, extended, complex texts. And then we go to writing. So we're rattling through here, and this is the reality of the classroom, isn't it? We feel like we've got too little curriculum time to address these big needs. But if we can be precise about it, we can start to identify step by step, 1% by 1%, those improvements our pupils need through year 7, 8, and 9, and our curriculum can be designed with that in mind. So let's disaggregate writing, like we consider about reading and the complex act of reading literature. So with writing, every time we write, our brain is working hard, our working memory is maxed out. We're thinking about spelling, imagery, grammar, punctuation, audience, genre, how we plan our text, our handwriting, the purpose of our writing. All of these word choices, all of these things are being juggled at any one time. And the reality is that writing's like a game of chess, that brilliantly complex game that's full of lots of moves and counter moves, and our pupils need to understand the variations and the different moves of the game. For so many of our pupils entering year 7, they feel well practiced at the game. They've read lots of models. They're able to imitate those moves. And yet for lots of our pupils, the table is a mass of confusion. There is no organization, no coherence, and they don't understand the pieces or the moves. So again, how do we go back and break down, drawn from the evidence, and build a curriculum? That's where the likes of sentence building English mastery is one of those moves that's intentional throughout the curriculum. And that's one of the many moves, but one of the key moves in the game we should be explicit about. One of the helpful models, I think, to start to disaggregate and cluster the different moves together is the simple view of writing. So if we take transcription, for so many of our pupils, that's taking too much of their working memory. It's burning out their mental bandwidth. So spelling and handwriting, how do we make sure we intervene so handwriting is automatic? How do we ensure that spelling is an integral part of people's editing and their self-regulation when they're writing peel paragraphs and extended essays? Then we think about composition, a little separately, but of course related. Composing at the sentence level, selecting the right word for the job, for descriptive writing, to select the right phrase to balance our debate. And so that sentence level selection of words, of building sentences and paragraphs, then leads to this almost overarching focus on executive function, the brain's ability to do those bigger strategic moves, plan, maintain your motivation, organize your ideas, make sure you've got your notes, and then cohere and sustain your way through a difficult, tricky task, editing, revising, drafting, reviewing, etc. So when we start to cluster the moves, the simple model is helpful. It starts to organize and narrow our focus. Just like our curriculum in 7, 8, and 9 can identify where are those sentence level moves happening in year 7? Where do we build cumulatively in year 8? And if I think about my own son during COVID, he was in year 4 at the start, he's in year 6 now, he's about to do his SATs next week. And again, his reading ability in SATs will be tethered to his ability to write his ideas coherently. One of the things I've written about and talked about is even just with a couple of months of typing and mainly doing his work on the laptop via school, actually his handwriting atrophied really quickly. It's quite, you know, kind of amazing to see. And yet we undertook writing sprints. We were intentional about handwriting, letter formation, some of these details that, again, in secondary school, we can take for granted. And with some practice, with some self-regulation, with some targeted questioning, Noah was able to enhance his handwriting and get back to a previous standard and improve upon it really quite quickly. So a bit like reading fluency, handwriting fluency is something we can make big differences to in short order if we're focused in on those moves and if we've built them in year 7, year 8, year 9. So there's benefits to be had here. And if we're developing deliberate writers beyond just handwriting and spelling, we're thinking about, where does the evidence indicate our best bets? Well, sentence combining, that simple act of combining multiple sentences into two sentences into one complex sentence. We know that this benefits children's writing development. It's one of those moves that we can practice and rehearse. Sentence shrinking. There's again a deliberate act when we're reading and talking to shrink down our ideas into singular summary sentences. So again, there's precision we can act and practice and rehearse throughout our key stage. And the sentence expounding, you know, one of the realities, isn't it, where those, you know, better writers have more elaborate descriptions. They have more analysis of evidence. Now, of course, so much of that is dependent on your knowledge and how many ideas you can bring to your writing, but it's also a move. You know, how do we model for an argument text, an essay, how to expand clause upon clause to have a balanced, detailed sentence? How, in our descriptive writing, our narrative writing, can we expand upon a clause and think carefully where we need to expand and have an elaborate multi-clausal sentence and where we need to shrink it to a simple sentence for rhythmic effect? And then finally, pretty much for, again, argumentative writing, essay writing, sentence signposting, to have that cohesion of argument, you know, the classic use of discourse markers. But also there's a signposting when it comes to thinking about narrative and narrative shifts, etc. So again, these are deliberate moves. The evidence indicates sentence level work is just within that kind of, you know, realm of capability for all of our pupils, but we need to rehearse it, practice it, and embed it into the bigger picture of our curriculum. And I want to end with a focus on PD. One of the things, so Nick might talk about the review that the EEF did of English mastery. And what we recognize is we can have a great curriculum. We might have a decent curriculum now, but so much of this is about the structured support, the wraparound resources, and thinking carefully about the time and dialogue in PD. One of the benefits of joining programs is you get that additional support. And what our evidence indicates, so this is taken from our recent effective professional development guidance report, is that there are certain specific mechanisms or kind of moves in the CPD game that our English departments need to undertake to stick those habits. And when we take a curriculum that's so well developed, like English Mastery for Year 7, we need to think about how to integrate that into our existing habits, what to intelligently adapt, to think about how our pupils are responding to it. And so getting that buy-in is critical, but also having that PD time and that regular rhythm. So it's not good enough to have a great curriculum or to have lots of great subject dialogue and great discussions about illusions in Grapes of Wrath. We need to mobilize this through clear structures to support our colleagues. And one of the case studies we used in that guidance was English Mastery, because we think that they've got a careful attention to those mechanisms, and that's a critical support. If you're in a school with turnover of staff or, you know, department that's looking for some big changes, that's particularly crucial. But I think we always underestimate. I led a really experienced English department, but I think I always underestimated the challenge and the mechanisms needed to keep that department moving and keep that curriculum design and development moving in a positive fashion. So I just end with questions that we think about in terms of professional development, in terms of our colleagues, in terms of taking on a brilliant curriculum, no matter how good that curriculum is, how do we mobilize it? How do we implement it well in practice? So what are we doing currently, and what might we do better in terms of breaking down the complex act of reading and writing? What approaches are our colleagues already confident in, and what can we build upon? What approaches do we need to get better at? I think too many of our approaches to whole class reading are tacit, and that we could be more deliberate. Our approaches to fluency, our approaches to handwriting, our approaches to spelling and the act of writing. And what misconceptions and beliefs do we have? Because we need to have that open dialogue. We'll often feel really comfortable with the curriculum we've always taught, and yet for our pupils, they may need a different diet to be able to access that complexity at GCSE and beyond. And that requires we support our colleagues as well as challenge any misconceptions. So I'll just say thank you, and I'll stop there. And I'll recognize that there might be, understandably, some questions, and I'm very open to any discussion about the presentation and unpacking and mastering those fundamentals.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was a whistle-stop tour with 7 minutes to spare as well, mastering the fundamentals. So if you do have any questions for Alex, do feel free to write them in the chat, and I'll happily fill them to Alex. That's the second time I've heard Alex do this presentation, and every single time, both times rather, I've come up with so many kind of questions and so many ideas. I'll start, if I can, with a couple of questions for you. So I'm going to make an assumption here that many of the colleagues in the call may be secondary specialists. What kinds of risks or what kinds of assumptions are we at risk of making in the secondary phase about how students come to year 7? What kind of knowledge, procedural, or what kind of knowledge are we at risk of assuming students have fluency in when they arrive in year 7? And what are the kind of how can that play out?
So what I mentioned earlier, that we know from national assessments, a quarter of pupils joining year 7 didn't meet the expected standard in year 6. And yet the reading demand is even higher in year 7, 8 and beyond. So straight away, any assumption that pupils, when they're reading a new text, are able to bring those allusions to the text, make those rich inferences and connections, have that that great dialogue, that book talk we privilege in the classroom. Actually, for so many students, they don't get over those first hurdles. In the chess game, they don't do very much beyond moving the pawns in terms of reading the words fluently, understanding, bringing enough vocabulary knowledge to the page. So they're grappling with what we can term the basics, and that doesn't allow them to engage in that rich dialogue. And then we have such a variety within our year 7 classes and beyond. So that's a difficulty, isn't it, in terms of we're reading poetry or we're undertaking a piece of extended writing, and there's so much variety in knowledge and skill. So I think what we often do, in my experience, I felt spectacularly undertrained for when pupils had reading barriers or writing barriers. So we kind of just crack on, don't we? And we pick good texts and we talk about them, and we do lots of scaffolding and lots of modeling.
And those scaffolds don't get taken away. So, those peel paragraphs and those, sentence stems, we start to see those kind of just linger and linger. And then we get exam complaints, by GCSE about kind of formulaic writing. But understandably, most teachers have not taken the scaffold away because so many pupils are struggling with those basics. And I think that's where in 7, 8 and 9, attention to decoding words, to reading fluency, to vocabulary, to sentence level work. 10 years ago, I wasn't thinking of most of those things. I was thinking about what books I was choosing, and I was thinking about kind of the full tasks. And I think the more we've understood, the more we've had to break down the rules and to kind of disaggregate the complex moves of both reading and writing. So there is no quick fix here. Some of it requires assessment, and support from SEND and from other experts in the school. But actually, my experience is, well, you still have to teach everyone in the room, and they need to be able to access Shakespeare in year 8, and they need to be able to write extended arguments in year 9. So, I think it's a varied, complex challenge, the better we understand that variety, the better we understand the moves, the more targeted and precise we are, the more explicit we are, like on sentence level moves, the more chance every pupil's got to access the curriculum.
Thank you. I've got another one. You describe, and you may be restating something which you covered, but just again for my benefit, you described a lot of the ways we want students to become strategic readers. How do you see that as being fundamentally different, or do you see it as being fundamentally different to assuming reading strategies, right? So the old national, the national curriculum and or various those old A4 binders of the reading strategies, reading intervention programs, whatever. How do you see being a strategic reader as being distinct from reading strategies that we've perhaps adopted or taught in part?
Yeah. So I think being a strategic reader is not practicing GCSE questions. Now there's a place in year 11 and in parts of year 10 for practicing certain question types, but actually for the last couple of decades they've trumped so much more than they probably should, in terms of you only get so many advances from practicing those question types. So that's why it's not practicing certain question types. We don't make predictions generically, we don't summarize generically. It's always in response to the text. The analogy I'll use is like a jigsaw. Okay, so what we require every time we read a complex text is we require the pieces to create that picture, to create that mental model. And those pieces of the jigsaw are like your background knowledge. That's word knowledge, that's generic knowledge, the allusions to literature and the world, all of those pieces. Now, when you've got the full jigsaw, great, you've got the full mental model, you can write about it, you can talk about the text, etc. So for so many of our students, of course, they don't have all the pieces. They have lots of gaps in their knowledge. But then the strategy element, I think, is a little bit like when you're doing a jigsaw. Where do you start? Well, we might organize them into colors. We might start with corners. Now, that only gets you so far. If you don't have the pieces, you can't move them into place, can you? You can't be strategic about it. But there are some strategies that we enact when we're reading, that good readers do, that are important, and that lots of our novice readers don't think to use them. So if we're studying Macbeth and we've just read the opening scene and you've got the three witches, and you've got the weather and pathetic fallacy, and you've got all of those details, well, we know that pupils will have background knowledge of witches. We know they'll have pieces to that puzzle. They might be missing other pieces. So before we dive into the word by word analysis, we might unpack and explore and question the representation of women and witches. So we're being strategic, we're making sure we activate what we already know about witches. That allows us to be filling in the complex language that Shakespeare's using. That allows us to then reach into how a witch is perceived during this period in history and James I, etc., etc. So I think when we take the text, it's about modeling and thinking aloud how we question a text. It might be where we model, what does this word mean? Has anyone, heard of this simile before? Does this ring any bells? That is being strategic reader. That's a reading strategy of questioning as we read, predicting, making predictions, clarifying word knowledge, clarifying imagery, and they're seemingly things that just feel natural to good readers. They are natural for all of us. But when you look at, if you go on YouTube, you can look at a video of reciprocal reading. It's just making more explicit those different roles and those questioning approaches and those considerations. Now, what I would say about reading strategies is we shouldn't be spending hour upon hour practicing them or modeling them or displaying them and doing them every week. Like a good approach, we could focus for a number of weeks at the start of the school year, embed some talk routines around what we read and establish that questioning of the text, establish that clarification, and then just reiterate it and model it when we're facing different, more complex texts. So we don't need to be modeling reading comprehension strategies all the time, every day. But again, we're careful and we're thinking, where is this integrated into our teaching? Where in our curriculum is this most useful? And I think reading strategies become more useful with a really difficult text. So you need to be more strategic with Shakespeare, with Macbeth, than you do with a contemporary poem. I've just recognizing contemporary poem could mean 100 more complex things than Shakespeare, but you get the idea of straight away the language barrier of Shakespeare. So I think it's getting that balance right between knowledge, strategy, and ultimately reading comprehension strategies are not exam questions. They don't spin as separate skills. They're not skills. This is about the things good readers do to strategically piece together the puzzle of a complex text. And when you see it like that, it feels like, oh, that's kind of what we do already, but maybe we're just a bit more explicit about it, a bit more intentional about it.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that deliberation, that being deliberate about practice, about how and when we draw on those different strategies. That's how the strategic reader emerges. Of course, we're reading lots of different texts, lots of different domains, engaging with in many from lots of different angles, and with that breadth, the depth can emerge, and with the depth, the breadth can emerge too. I could spend the next 15 minutes just picking your brains. But I'm delighted to say I've got some information to share about the English Mastery EEF trial that we're currently recruiting for. If anyone does have any further questions for Alex will, I'm sure, Alex, if you're able to hang around in the chat, he'll be able to type some responses. But I'm now going to spend the remainder of the session sharing with you some information about the English Mastery Education Endowment Trial that we're currently recruiting for September 2022. To start off with, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who English Mastery are, how we work with Ark schools, and then tell you all about the fantastic insights we've got from a previous EEF trial that happened in 2019. English Mastery launched in the Ark Schools Multi-Academy Trust in 2014 with a focus on designing and launching an English curriculum, professional development offer, implementation infrastructure, and an assessment framework to really support English teachers to evolve and to develop their implementation of a high quality Key Stage 3 English curriculum. At the moment, we currently work with around 200 schools, including Ark schools, but we work with schools across the country. We currently partner with about 200 schools. As I mentioned, in 2019, the EEF ran a randomised controlled trial, which had to be suspended due to the COVID. But the findings were published last week, and I'm going to share some of the findings with you shortly. Ark Curriculum Plus is the umbrella organisation for Ark's Mastery programme, including English Mastery, Mathematics Mastery, Primary, Secondary, and Science Mastery. We're part of the Ark Schools Multi-Academy Trust. We are a non-for-profit organisation. We're a charitable organisation, so everything that we do when schools partner with us, or any cost that we invite schools to undertake, goes back into running the programme. It's run at cost. So we are a charitable organisation, always worth making clear. And our mission as an organisation is to empower teachers to give all young people the subject knowledge and the skills that will allow them to succeed. So we work in partnerships with schools to empower their teaching staff. So why exactly does English Mastery exist? A very brief potted history. We found as we were launching the programme back in 2014 that the pass rates in the schools that we were working with were good, but the progress wasn't what we were expecting to see. What we weren't seeing those students go on to get in 2014, those B's, A's, A stars, they were certainly capable of. We also found that lots of Key Stage 4 was spent making up ground from Key Stage 3. It really felt as if we were 2 steps behind in our practice in Key Stage 4, and we were really just chasing our tail a little bit. Some of the fundamentals that Alex has described were not in place. We also see, and this continues to be a challenge today, the most experienced, confident colleagues were deployed on GCSE classes. And one of the kind of upshots for that is that in Key Stage 3, there was a void of clarity around what the curriculum should look like. How should students be progressing from term to term, from year to year? And that content wasn't as rich, as stimulating, as challenging as perhaps it could be. And to illustrate that point, here is a typical scheme of learning from one of our schools from not very long ago. And we found that there was, as a descriptive example, the autobiography unit of work was cribbed from the T drive back from 5 years ago. The short story on the landlady was brought in by the teach first person who got it from their mate who was teaching it up the road. The theme park unit of work was cribbed from the TES, and there was a very etc. What you can see how that kind of plays out, and there was very little consideration around how those units should be conversing with each other, how they should be developing that knowledge term to term, year on year, and how it led to a cohesive, cumulative experience for students, so they would graduate each term, each year, more successful than the last, and that they'd be even more successful when they come to study GCSE, A-level, undergraduate studies too. Identifying these issues led us to undertake a bit of research and to really think, what does education research, what does cognitive science tell us about how we can address these specific issues in English teaching? So we drew on colleagues, which many of whom will be familiar to you: Daniel Willingham, Dylan William, Ruth Miskin, Hart and Risley, Brecht and Leslie, Tim Oates, and they led to our intentions for the curriculum, how we wanted to structure and design our curriculum program, including work on Tier 2 vocabulary. For further information, do consult your copy of Closing the Vocabulary Gap by Alex Quigley. How we teach grammar and writing. For further information, make sure you pre-order your copy of Closing the Writing Gap, for forthcoming publication by Alex Quigley, and so on and so forth. We really had that research base at the heart of the design of our curriculum. And in 2020, so that is true of how we developed and the program from 2014 to today. What relevance does that have in today's world? Well, in 2022, we know with the COVID disruptions that affected students' learning, high quality teaching, it always has been the best possible way to mitigate any learning loss, any learning decay. And we're committed in Ark Curriculum Plus, in English Mastery, to synthesize that education research. What does research tell us works best, and to place that in our program so that schools have the tools, guidance, resource, support to implement that research in their own practice, and to have those transformative impact in students to close those learning gaps. In English Mastery, what does our program entail? A resource curriculum, a curriculum progression framework, and I'll flash up what that entails shortly. But having some teaching materials is just a piece of the puzzle. Without the lesson guidance and resources, that's a key part of supporting teacher workload, supporting the intent of the curriculum. But around that, we have a wraparound support around our training and development provision to make sure that all colleagues, whether you're an early career teacher, whether you're a head of department, whether you're a senior leader, have the confidence, the knowledge, and the insight to implement that curriculum and to own it as your own school's curriculum program. And we also support schools to evaluate how well is this program impacting our students. Are our students graduating through the curriculum? Often to say that the curriculum is the progression model, in which instance, how can we support schools to identify whether or not students are progressing through that curriculum at an appropriate rate to make sure that they are being more successful as Key Stage 3 continues and as they enter Key Stage 4. So I said I'd describe what's in that curriculum progression framework. Here is an oversight, like a snapshot of some of the curriculum materials. So it includes lesson by lesson PowerPoints, lesson guides, multiple choice exit tickets designed to disrupt the forgetting curve with fortnightly quizzes, reteach tasks for those fortnightly quizzes, standardization booklets to identify how well students are performing on a term-by-term basis, compare their performance to their peers nationally, knowledge organizers, teacher-facing knowledge definitions, which explicitly identify what students should know, remember, do at any point in the curriculum, and a teacher development program that supports them to implement that curriculum. So our program induction allows teachers to have that research summary, see mastery in action with teachers and video footage of teachers teaching the program. Our assessment training underpins some misconceptions, some commonly held challenges of assessment pedagogy in English and in education, and how we can actually use current live students' work to set standards on a national cohort. And our school support program, where we work intimately with schools to implement that curriculum with fidelity, with faith, with real success in their own contexts. So our mastery lead will support schools in that one-to-one basis to really help them to own that curriculum, take it forward. And this isn't to intimidate or overwhelm or impress. It's merely to show, for those schools who are trying to embark upon their own curriculum development journey, to try to do this by themselves, it can be hugely overwhelming to understand how much resource is required to deliver this scope of curriculum, to deliver this scale of curriculum change. And a resource curriculum like English Mastery offers schools such a fantastic foundation, such a great platform with which to implement their own curriculum. And that doesn't say anything about our really responsive support that we offered schools during the COVID-19 pandemic too. To speak a little bit of the support that we offer schools, as Alex mentioned, we have been featured as a small case study in the EEF's summary on effective professional development. So there is, we have been, in terms of the reassurance of the quality of our professional development. Again, there's some external kind of validation there from the EEF. And speaking of external validation from the EEF, on Friday, the EEF published their report into English Mastery from the 2019 trial. As described, it was a randomized control trial, and the intention of that RCT was to compare the difference in attainment between the control group and the intervention group. And the outcomes measures we had to suspend due to COVID. We didn't want to place any further unnecessary burden on the sector for those students who were who'd been through so much during the disruptions. However, we do have a really robust qualitative set of data to share with you, or what teachers have to say about English Mastery. And we have some phenomenal results. These are really, in terms of education research, these findings are really, really, really positive. 75% of teachers were saying that English Mastery helped students' overall progress. 74% said it helped their grammar skills, 68% their writing skills, 63% their reading skills. 89% of teachers said the literary heritage strand was quite or very effective. 73% saying our writing curriculum was quite or very effective. Again, really positive figures in terms of our research. And a really big one, the first time this question had been asked in education research, 80% of teachers said that English Mastery helped to reduce teachers' planning with regard to marking. It helped reduce their workload, with regard to planning and marking. So a huge, immensely proud of the ways in which we've been able to support schools with workload over what has been unquestionably one of the most challenging, the challenging contextual kind of times in the professions faced. So that's a little bit about what we do, how we do it, and what impact we have. We're presently recruiting for a 2-year randomized controlled trial for English Mastery. It's going to evaluate the impact of the trial, impact of English Mastery on 2022's Year 7 cohort. The way an RCT works is it divides schools into a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group, half the schools will be allocated into, and they'll receive English Mastery. It will evaluate the impact the programme has on their Year 7s after 2 years. There is a cost involved to schools. We want schools to have some skin in the game, so they are committed to the programme, and it is enormously subsidised by the Department for Education. So schools will pay £900 in Year 1 and the same again in the second year of the trial, which represents a huge saving. And the control group will not receive English Mastery, but they will receive a payment for participating in research activity, such as submitting data and participating in interviews with our evaluators. So there's a 50-50 chance you'll be in the treatment or the control school. To participate, you need to be a state school, non-selective. You need to have a Year 7 cohort in 2022, which does discount some middle schools, and you may not have delivered English Mastery past.